Good evening. I am Alyssa Tardif, Director of Education here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I am delighted to welcome you to Founding Women: Ideas of Independence. Yes. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to welcome the K-12 teachers attending this evening. Teachers play a critical role in ensuring students learn important stories like the ones our panelists will share tonight. Would all the K-12 teachers please stand to be recognized? Thank you so much. As you may know, the MHS is the proud sponsor and organizer of the History and Civics program Massachusetts History Day, or MHD. Every year, we select 2 teachers participating in MHD to honor their significant contributions to the growth and success of the program. Tonight, we would like to honor this year's Massachusetts History Day Teachers of the Year. Our MHD Teacher of the Year for the Junior Division, which is middle school, is Kirsten Bowl. Kirsten is a grade 7 teacher at Mashpee Middle High School, where she leads a team of teachers who implemented MHD for all 7th graders 7 years ago. Kirsten, would you please stand? Our Massachusetts History Day Teacher of the Year for the Senior Division, high school, is Michael Lee. Michael teaches grades 10 and 11 at Winchester High School and has taught MHD for 12 years, helping to sustain and grow the very successful program in Winchester. Mike, would you please stand? You can see both Kirsten and Mike in action at the MHD state contest at Winchester High School on April 11th, shameless plug, where we highly encourage you to volunteer to judge for us. This evening, our distinguished speakers will explore the words and lives of Mercy Otis Warren, Abigail Adams, and Phillis Wheatley, influential founding women of the American Revolution. I was delighted to speak with Mercy, Abigail, and Phillis, as well as Martha Washington during the reception. Please join me in thanking our historical interpreters, Michelle Gabrielson as Mercy Otis Warren, Audrey Sook-Gerard as Abigail Adams, Catherine Philippe as Phillis Wheatley, and Sandy Spector as Martha Washington. Now I'm honored to introduce tonight's panelists. Dr. Rosemary Zagari is a distinguished university professor specializing in early American history at George Mason University. The Wall Street Journal named her book, A Woman's Dilemma: Mercy Otis Warren and the American Revolution, one of the 5 best books on revolutionary women. Dr. Tara Bynum is an associate professor of English and African American Studies and a scholar of early African American literary histories before 1800 at University of Iowa. Her 2023 book, Reading Pleasures, examines the ways in which 18th century enslaved and free men and women feel good or experience pleasure in spite of the privations of slavery, unfreedom, or white supremacy. Dr. Sarah Martin is the editor-in-chief of the Adams Papers here at the MHS. In her role, she oversees the print and digital publication of the collective writings of Abigail Adams, John Adams, and their descendants. Dr. Jacqueline Beatty is Associate Professor of History at York College of Pennsylvania. Her first book, In Dependence, Women and the Patriarchal State in Revolutionary America, was published in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beatty to begin tonight's conversation.
Okay, everyone can hear me okay? Usually I project just fine without a microphone, so just somebody wave if I'm a little bit too loud. So regarding, I think, the title of tonight's panel, that's kind of where I wanted to start. I'd like to ask each of you to discuss how each woman may have contributed to American independence, how we can consider them to be founders of the United States, and perhaps what the revolution or independence meant to them. We'll start with a really easy, simple question. Yeah. And anybody can start. I won't call on you all.
All right. So I'll start with Mercy Otis Warren. And as a lot of you know, well, one point I want to make it, all of these are women of Massachusetts. And I think it's not an accident. And another early woman founder, if you will, is Judith Sargent Murray, also from Massachusetts. And I think the high literacy rate in general among people in Massachusetts at the time of the Revolution was very instrumental, first of all, in mobilizing the people of Massachusetts in favor of resistance and then revolution. But women themselves were also highly literate. I'm starting to give you a very long answer. But anyway, Mercy Otis Warren, then, as some of you may know, was one of the few women who wrote publicly for publication in support of first resistance during the 1760s. She wrote poems and then satirical plays. And these were published not under her own name, but under a pseudonym, which was not uncommon at the time. But within a circle of Massachusetts revolutionaries, she had been encouraged by John Adams, by her husband, by her brother, James Otis, to produce these publications to help inspire independence. And she was an extremely well-read person. She wasn't just literate. She had been educated along with her brother, James Otis, and had read the classics of ancient Greece and Rome in translation. She had read the classics of history, of literature. In any case, what does independence mean? I think in a certain way, independence meant to Mercy Otis Warren what it came to mean to many male people in Massachusetts, male individuals. That is freedom from British tyranny, and that is the right to self-government, the right to have the liberties, the rights and privileges of the subjects of Great Britain, which they could no longer practice as members of the British Empire. So that is the push toward independence from Great Britain. And she wrote very conventionally in many ways about that subject of liberty, especially in her 1805 History of the American Revolution. She wrote conventionally in the sense of many male writers also wrote in that vein. But I think for a woman of her generation, independence came to mean something very different, and it had a personal valence that took on special meaning for her lives and the lives of many other women who were not perhaps as prominent as she was. And so Mercy Otis Warren and the women of the revolutionary generation were raised in an environment in which women were expected as adults to be wives and mothers. And there was a sense of mutuality, and autonomy was not something valued in a woman. Independence was not something valued. It was mutuality. And unlike, yes, there was an idea of subordination of women, but in a marriage, men and women were helpmeets. But through her writing, first in the pre-revolutionary era, and then in her writing of the History of the American Revolution, which she published afterward, and other poems and plays, she gained a sense of self-confidence and a sense of her own independence, so that after the revolution, she started publishing under her own name. She started being what we might see as more assertive in herself. She published her 1790 collection of poems and plays under her own name and got the copyright. And as some of you may know, in a famous exchange with John Adams, who disparaged her abilities as a historian, she vehemently defended her abilities and said, "You are trying to intimidate me, but I will not be intimidated." So I think she is an example, an extreme example, but many other women gained a sense of self-confidence, even within marriage, as a result of their participation in varying ways, not just through writing, through the revolution.
I would agree.
But I think if we think about independence as a process of ideological revolution, and it is this transformation within society where the majority of people go from thinking of themselves as British subjects to Americans, then women are absolutely part of that transformation. Abigail Adams thinks of herself as a patriot, no less than her husband does. And she is engaging with the intellectual ideas of the time. You know, she is taking in that information and she is thinking about it. She is debating it with friends and family. She is coming to her own conclusions about what her ideological stance is related to those ideas. And the difference, right? That's what the founders are doing. She's not doing it on the floor of Congress because she is not elected, because she is excluded from that political arena. But it doesn't mean that she's not engaging in politics or engaging in the political sphere. So I think if we think about it as more society transformation, then women are more part of that conversation. And Abigail absolutely would have set herself in that landscape.
Sure.
So one of the things that I have been thinking, listening to these two very well articulated responses, is I've been thinking about the war itself, like what it means to live in a place where war is actually happening. And I think that what feels important to me when thinking about women of various racial categories, class categories, and how this period of time may have affected how they understand themselves. I think that it's kind of important for us to remember that for those women in particular who are living in Boston, they are living where the war is happening. So it's not just a theoretical war for independence. There are battles, massacres. There's a harbor that's under siege. That means that, you know, folks have to leave and go other places because they don't have access to food. So when thinking about kind of the assertiveness or the kind of independent spirit, that might actually be a function of, like, if you need to eat, and the husband that society has tied you to is off fighting or politicking or whatever, like, yeah, you have to figure out how to be assertive because you don't want to be hungry. So I think in the context of Phillis Wheatley, what I find myself often being reminded of is that Wheatley is living through this war, and it does absolutely affect her as someone who is just having to confront the reality of death, the sound of violence, the actual experience of living alongside that violence, while at the same time figuring out how to publish a book of poems, figuring out where to go when the British make her a refugee and she finds herself in Providence, Rhode Island. So I guess as I wrestle with the answer to this question, I think I guess I invite all of us to think about the fact that this is not just a war that includes paper documents, but it is a war that includes blood, violence, et cetera. And that is so much a part of how these women are understanding themselves and thinking of themselves and thinking of the nation that they might hope comes to be, but they also don't know that.
Yeah.
And I think that too is an interesting part of the story. We know what happens, but if we go back and ask Mercy, Abigail, and Phillis in 1773 what they think is going to happen, or in 1776 what they think is going to happen, or maybe even in 1780 what they think is going to happen, like they don't actually know.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think sometimes, especially around 250th commemorations, we think a lot about the ideas and the words on paper, but not much about the lived experience of the war, which was incredibly challenging, especially for women in these circumstances. And I want to kind of switch gears a little bit, but to kind of piggyback off of something each of you said, I'm wondering, because each of these women is in a lot of ways exceptional and unique from one another, but unique from other women. So to what degree are these women's experiences exceptional versus emblematic of what we might consider an ordinary woman's experience of the war, to the extent that there was such a thing?
Everybody was looking at me. That's funny. This time I actually was thinking I'll start. So that's okay. You know, I wrestle with the word unique. And I wrestle with the word unique because I think that on the one hand, you're right. Someone like Phillis Wheatley is unique. But I think in some other ways, Wheatley is not exactly unique. And so I guess she is unique in as much as she is understood to be the kind of first Black person to publish a book of poems in, you know, kind of the I can't say the US because it doesn't exist yet, but what becomes the US. So there's something unique about that. But I think that given what little people know about Wheatley, I think the conversations often kind of like get hemmed up at her literacy. And that ends up being a marker of her uniqueness, except that, as Rosemary pointed out, like literacy is actually not necessarily unique and not even unique among Black people or enslaved people. I think there are kind of countless examples of Black people's literacy. So in that way, Wheatley is not necessarily unique. And even at the Massachusetts Historical Society, the letters between Wheatley and Uber Tanner. Uber Tanner is another literate Black woman, and they are reading each other's letters, writing letters to one another. I think it's interesting at some point, Wheatley sends her proposal to Tanner for a review, which makes me wonder, you know, what else Tanner is writing. So I think there's a way to kind of around Wheatley and Tanner and there's a way to build out a community of other literate Black people. So I'm a little hesitant about the uniqueness because I think that for women in general and certainly Black women in particular, the one can be the only one that gets focused on because they are understood to be the most unique. And yet the deeper I dive into the 18th century, the more people I find, but they just end up not being as marketable as Wheatley because no one's ever heard of them. You know, Uber Tanner is still not quite a household name. If I whip out Eve Brown, if I talk about this one, if I talk about, you know, no one will know who I'm talking about. And yet these women do exist. And I think that, and they exist at this moment when there's so much shifting, there's so much happening. And I would suggest that they too are also wrestling with how to live and survive and make sense of their living during this war. Love the people.
I love that you narrowed in on unique because we always want to think of Abigail as exceptional. And she is in so many ways when you read her letters. But she stands out because we know so much more about her because of the body of writing she left. And so if we think about Abigail as a wife during the war whose husband has left, who takes on additional responsibilities to secure her family's economic well-being, she is fairly normal and ordinary. The fact that that continues far beyond many other women through necessity with her husband's kind of longer separation, but also through aptitude because she has a talent for kind of financial management and really comes to take on that responsibility for her family largely through their retirement in 1801 and is very successful at it, then she stands out. But I come back to, I make my bread and butter by reading these people's letters day in and day out, right? I have read Abigail for 20 years now, and I dearly love her. And of course, I think she's remarkable. But we are so privileged to know so much about her because she has left such a record as well.
Just piggybacking on some of these comments, especially about remembering that these are women living through the experience of war and revolution. I think it's important to understand that the revolution opened up perils and possibilities for women, and not just these highly literate women or women whose husbands were well known. I think that these ordinary women were forced, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, to become the keepers of the home, to make sure that the children were taken care of without the help of a man in the house. And, with Mercy Otis Warren, but this was true of many other women, Abigail, we know in particular, they were kind of pushed into these roles. And it's not as if men were saying, oh, the American Revolution is a great opportunity to expand the role of women. This was a unforeseen, and for many men and women, not particularly good consequence. But I think war itself creates these dislocations. For many enslaved women, they ran away. They ran away from their homes, plantations, families, not Phillis, of course. She was freed, though. And so, I think the war itself was perilous and created burdens, but it also offered new opportunities.
So we've been talking a lot about how the war is impacting women's lives and these women's lives in particular. And I've been trying to think about what these women kind of have in common as well. And I think one thing that kind of sticks out is the incredible female friendships and female networks that they had in their lives. So I'm wondering if each of you could talk about the role of those female friendships and networks in each woman's life.
All right. So I think when you're talking about Abigail and the relationship she built with women, first and foremost, it is her sisters who are her closest friends and confidants. Her older sister, Mary Smith Cranch, her younger sister, Elizabeth Smith Shaw Peabody. But of those two, it is really Mary. And we don't necessarily see that as much during the Revolution because they are living in closer proximity to one another. But if you look at the trajectory of her correspondence, the letters that Abigail writes during the presidency to her sister Mary are by far the best letters she writes during that period because she felt very much the need to kind of restrain herself. She writes sometimes, my pen is freer than my tongue. But she lets that guard down with her sister, and they're just wonderful and juicy. And I encourage you all to read them. But I think when it comes to kind of women outside of her family circle, Mercy is one. They meet when Abigail is still fairly young in 1773, and they maintain a sometimes rocky friendship and correspondence, but one that lasts for 40 years. And then I think her other really close confidant is Hannah Phillips Cushing, who she meets around the same time. They actually meet in 1776. They don't start corresponding till the 1790s. But Hannah was the wife of a Massachusetts judge who went on to become a Supreme Court justice. And they remain very close. They do not have the same kinds of disagreements that she does with Mercy, also really up until Abigail dies.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When we're thinking about the revolution in particular, and your mention of dates got me thinking about this, how old are these women?
So Abigail was born in 1744, so she's in her 30s.
Okay.
With 4 young children who range from 10 to 3. It's another couple in there, but there's 4 who survive.
And Mercy Otis Warren was in her 50s with five more or less grown sons, one of whom served in the Revolution.
Okay. And Wheatley is in her 20s, and is married by 1779, and dies by 1784, around like 31-ish. It feels helpful to just kind of for a moment sort of know when in each of their lives they are. So Wheatley, I think, has a very well documented friendship with a woman named Uber Tanner, who I mentioned, who lives in Newport, Rhode Island, until she is displaced to Worcester, Massachusetts, when Newport is under siege. And I think that their relationship ends up being very well documented because Uber Tanner keeps the letters. And I think there are 8 or 9 of them that are extant. One that belongs to a private party, and then the remainder, that 7 or 8, are here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I think that what they do very well is sort of make clear, from Wheatley to Tanner, there are no letters from Tanner to Wheatley that I know of, but if anyone knows where they are, I'm happy to receive that information. But I think they absolutely document kind of the friendship that exists between these 2 women. And the thing that I think is most exciting about the letters, they're very churchy. There is sort of little mention, with the exception of a letter that's dated February 14th, 1776. There's very little mention of kind of the world outside of their faith. And I had never thought to wonder why until I fell down a rabbit hole. So how they get to the Massachusetts Historical Society is actually it mentioned in a footnote that's in the proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I spent part of today trying to figure out like where Charles Dean has put the letter that he transcribes in this footnote that explains the provenance of these letters. He didn't put the letter here though. Can you believe that? Like, come on, Charles. Like, what are you thinking about? You have one job.
Yeah.
Put the letter here.
It's not considering future historians. It's very rude. Yeah.
Right. Thinking about
Right.
obviously not me.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, so what's interesting though is that in this transcription that finds its way into this footnote, he explains that, or the letter that he gets from Catherine Eads Beecher, who is a sister-in-law to Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's married to Harriet's older brother, William. I don't think anyone knows who William is. But William was the pastor of Uber Tanner's church. And so when Uber Tanner is like in maybe her 80s, maybe her 90s, in the 1830s, she gives Wheatley's letters to Catherine Eads Beecher. And I think that gesture to me speaks in a lot of ways about the relationship that she has to Wheatley, because she saved the letters for 50 years. So the letters are from 1772 to 1779, and it's the 1830s. So I think it's just interesting to kind of think about like what it takes to keep something for 50 years, and then what it takes to keep something for 50 years that you get as a 20 something. So, I think it in many respects, I think speaks volumes about the relationship that exists between Tanner and Wheatley. And eventually I think it speaks to the relationship between Catherine Eads Beecher and Tanner, because Catherine Eads Beecher is the one who gives them to Edward Hale, and Edward Hale gives them to Charles Dean, which is how they land here. So I think there's something really important about kind of the way that both women, Tanner and Beecher, saved these letters. And this is a long-winded way to say this, but the reason that I think the letters are so churchy, of course, is that she gives them to her pastor's wife. So, if we had to think for a moment about our letters that we wrote in our 20s, or our text messages from our 20s, or our various social media posts from our 20s, like, do you give them to all of them to your pastor's wife? Do you give them all to the worship leader wherever it is that you worship? Is that, do you hand them all over, or do you give the ones that feel most relevant? So it's like, oh, Tanner, in my view, has likely curated in a very particular way which letters find their way to Catherine Eads Beecher, and might, like, I'll take these to the grave, but Catherine can get the ones where we center Jesus. Like, I think it's not coincidental.
Yep.
I think, once again, let's go back to this experience of women in war. And we know that Mercy Otis Warren wrote a lot of letters to Abigail Adams, to Hannah Winthrop, and to others, John Adams too. But I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for what was happening among other women whose letters we don't have. And I think at an ordinary level, when the husbands are away at war or serving in politics, or when you know that the British can invade any moment, or when you know that the fate of your country is hanging in the balance because of what's going on, hundreds of miles away, you're just in a heightened state of awareness. And you're also facing these shortages. And so Mercy Otis Warren and many of these other women rely on their women friends for comfort, for solace, for political news. I mean, what I find fascinating is that Abigail Adams had her own little side business going on, selling buttons and lace and pins, things that were in short supply. And again, I think that's the tip of the iceberg. Women were exchanging goods with each other in an economy that operates below the level of the formal economy that we know that goes on between merchants and buyers. And so I think there were many ways in which women needed to rely on each other more during this time of war. And the letters that we have from women, or the examples of women's actions that we have from the women who wrote about them, are just reflective of much larger levels of experience in which these women's networks helped women get through this experience of war. I mean, Mercy Otis Warren's son lost a leg, and Abigail Adams was there to comfort her. And I think that must have happened over and over again.
Okay. Just in the interest of time, since I'm sure you all have questions that you'd like to ask, I'll close with one last question. And since it's March, it's Women's History Month. And this year, as I'm sure you well know, we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of American independence. And so we are at the nexus of these two things here at the end of the month. I think if we hope to see another 250 years for this country of ours, we maybe want to make sure that we learn from our forebears and from the scholars who study them. So to kind of leave this fairly open, I'm wondering if there's, maybe if I can phrase it in a way, if our friends were alive today, what wisdom might they impart on us, or what from their lives and experiences, especially of this difficult time in the revolution, might resonate with us today as we think about the next 250 years? Fingers crossed, right?
Well, I'll start with that because I think Mercy Otis Warren was very articulate about that. And what she emphasized was active citizenry, that people could not be passive in the face of transgressions on their rights and liberties, that women as well as men had a stake in society, that people had to be, and she would say, virtuous as well as vigilant. And by that she meant civically virtuous, willing to sacrifice for the public good. And I think she would say that, we can't take our liberties for granted, that we have to be strong in the face of attacks on those liberties. And what she did is say, when it comes down to it, we have to be willing to defend them. And she was quite explicit about that, especially in the period leading up to the revolution. And she helped inspire people to do just that.
Same. But actually, I'm going to give you one of my favorite Abigail quotations because I think it is still relevant today, and I think she would share it today for many of the reasons that Rosemary laid out. She writes in 1799, actually, she says, "If women do not hold the reins of government, I see no reason why they should not consider how they are held." And I think it is that idea of an active citizen, and that we all have a responsibility, whether we are in those seats of power, to exercise our voices to ensure that our democracy, what she fought for, what they fought for, survives.
So I think this is an interesting question. I'll start with kind of my takeaway first. So this is less about what Wheatley thinks and more about kind of what I have thought as I have read through countless primary sources. I think what's interesting is that the war is ever present, and also people still continue to do people-y things. And I think there are things that are very familiar. So my obsession is account books, and you'll still see people buying things and presumably taking those things to make things that can serve themselves and their communities. And I think there's something very interesting to me about kind of the need to maintain a certain kind of everydayness, even if there is war all around. Like you still need to eat and figure out how to eat. You still need clothes, you still need to make blankets, you still need to kind of care for yourself and those around you. The other thing that I think is interesting in the context of the 250 is that the way that the kind of mythology of the US works, 1776 becomes this very important moment. And it is in relation to this war that I keep returning to. My graduate students have learned that the war is the answer to every question that I ask. It's my current obsession. I think what's interesting is that that's not the moment that makes the country.
Yeah.
And if we fast forward to the Articles of Confederation, that's not the moment that makes the country. You know, the Constitution gets us a little bit closer, but then I think something interesting happens with the Naturalization Act, where we get to use this word citizen. We get an idea of who counts as a citizen, and it's white persons of good character. So, you know, I think in the context of thinking about Wheatley and the context of thinking about kind of the Black communities that I'm interested in, I think what they are well aware of is that they live in a place that is not set up to consider them as citizens from any sort of legal perspective. Even though I think that there is a sense of national identity, I think that there's a sense of belonging to this country. The actual legal meaning of belonging, the meaning that is tied to that word citizenship, I think they are well aware of the fact that they are not part of that. So you end up with the various kind of proto colonization efforts to get to Sierra Leone. So before Liberia, there's Sierra Leone, because folks are well aware, or even thinking about kind of the Black loyalists that end up on boats to various parts of the British Empire, because they know that these United States are not designed to include them. So, you know, I think that it's interesting that some of the themes that they were wrestling with and where they fit, the Black communities that I'm interested in, where they fit in the 1770s, the 1780s, and in the 1790s. I think in many respects, the same questions are being asked present day too. Like, there seems to still be a wrestling with what we mean by the word citizen. Like, who gets to be a citizen? Do you have to be born here to be a citizen now? So I think that the questions persist 250 years later.
Yeah, even when the Constitution is pretty clear about
Yeah.
what that means.
Yeah.
Some folks
We have amendments.
so clear on it, I suppose. Did you want to add? No. Okay, well, I'm sure you all have lots of questions, but if anybody wants to throw a hand up, got first offer right here. Somebody has mics in the room, I believe. Yes. Okay, so right up here.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and yet some people meet the challenge better than others. So obviously the reason we're talking about these three women today is that they met it and were very successful. Is there anything you could point to in their background or something about their upbringing that made them able to meet the challenge where others might not have done so as well?
Okay. Again, it's not necessarily that other people didn't, is that we know how they did. And, you know, Abigail grew up in a minister's household. She learned charity in her community with her mother. She created networks through her family. I don't know where she got the math skills necessarily, but she didn't get it at school. We know that. But she had great mentors and she had great tutors. And so some of this is our kind of ascribing meaning to their actions and their circumstances. But I think the networks, the lessons she learns at home, that idea of, you know, I mean, her religious background. But I think you started, the necessity is mother invention, you know. Jackie posed some of the questions, some of it I'm like, well, needs must.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, they do because they have to your point.
Yeah.
Like, you know, if someone is not there to help you support your family and they've run out of fabric and you can't clothe them, you have to find a way to do that. It's resourcefulness because of necessity. Oh.
I would also add that these women had proximity to wealth. And I think that proximity to wealth means that their papers have access to repositories like this one.
Yes.
So I think that is an important part of why we know their stories, know their words, and why we might not know another woman who is doing the exact same thing, but doesn't have the same sort of access to wealth that these three women do.
I think I saw, right here. Sorry, with the striped shirt. There we go. Thank you. I feel like I'm on a game show.
I also feel like I'm on a game show. Hi. So the question I have kind of stems from this concept you were talking about earlier about uniqueness and these women being very unique, especially as we consider them looking back today. So the reason why I kind of stem this question is I'm curious to have some of you talk more about what the reaction to these women at the time would have been. So especially related to the letters, the publications, and honestly, more than anything, I'm a big Phillis Wheatley fan. So I want to hear more about the conversations surrounding these women at the time. Like, what would the intersections of race and independence related to these women and their role within society at the time looked like, and what conversations would other people be having about them?
I love being at an event when someone says, I'm a big Phillis Wheatley fan, and we all just nod along. It's great. No, you're in the right place.
Right. I think Phillis Wheatley is famous. I've said this before. I was giving a talk once, and there was someone in the audience that was like, did anyone know who Phillis Wheatley was? And I was like, what? Phillis Wheatley was famous. So I say it over and over and again. So I think that is what's interesting about Wheatley in particular, is that I think that she is certainly well known within her Boston community that she's initially writing for. But I think when her book comes out in fall of 1773 and begins to make its rounds, I think there's so many people that are talking about this book. And I think by 1775, she is writing a letter to George Washington while he's camped out in Boston, and she's, I think, in Providence. What's interesting too is that when she dies, the notice of her death is published in, I think, at least 13 newspapers up and down the East Coast. And I think that does, in fact, put in perspective like how connected and well-known Wheatley is. There's probably a lot more that I could say about that, but I think the long and short of it is that we should understand Phillis Wheatley to be famous and famous in that way that we would mean kind of today. Like she is very well known.
Yeah, I'd actually say probably of these three women, she was the most well known at the time, and she was known transatlantically too. You know, as I mentioned, Mercy Otis Warren published her pre-revolutionary works under a pseudonym, but then afterwards started publishing under her own name, and 1790 Book of Poems and Plays, and then her 1805 History of the American Revolution. So she was known, especially in New England and especially among educated elites. I mean, George Washington bought her History of the Revolution. But she was always conscious that she was, as she would say, transgressing the boundaries of my sex. And there was a lot of pushback to a woman writing explicitly about political matters. She's very nervous and anxious, and she needs John Adams to say, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Of course, then John Adams, after she publishes her History of the American Revolution, turns around and says, history is not the province of the ladies. And so it's really a case where I think I was trying to allude to this earlier. For a woman like Mercy Otis Warren, her facility with the pen was useful to the revolutionaries before the American Revolution. But the idea of a woman actively engaging with politics was very threatening to men and to many women too. It was just a violation of the notion of that men were the dominated the political realm and women were to be in the home. And so I think what's interesting, like I always try to mention this to my students, Abigail Adams' famous letter that we quote today was a private letter at that time. Nobody knew about it except John Adams and Mercy Otis Warren at that time. So again, it's, as we've been trying to suggest, we know about these women because of their proximity to wealth, because of their literacy, the survival of their papers. But the whole idea of political women was very controversial. And I think, what was different about Wheatley is so much of her poetry was moral and religious. And I think that helped her gain acceptance in a lot of circles. But is that right? Or no?
I think that we can go with that.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it was, how challenging it was for women's self-conception to embrace these new roles at this time.
Well, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but John Adams was also not a fan of her history because he was not depicted in the best light in this work, correct?
That's correct.
So,
Yes.
But that's why.
right.
She'd been nicer to.
Right, exactly. This is what I'm saying. Like,
Right.
it was all women's fault, but yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, right here in the blue. Oh, wait for them. Okay.
I was wondering for each of you, when you were doing your research, was there something that you found about each of them that you were like, you know what, I really like this person. This resonates with me. This is something that is cool. Like in that regard.
One of the most touching moments for me in doing my research about Mercy Otis Warren was that when she does get her 1790 book of poems and plays published, and she publishes it under her own name, and she gets the copyright, because in the new United States, you could copyright literary property. And this was a new thing. She says that she writes to one of her sons and she says, I'm leaving you the copyright to this book because it is really the only thing I own as a woman. She was not allowed as a married woman to own property, but her literary property, her intellectual property was her own. And I just thought that was really moving. And I thought it's this very significant change in the way she thought about herself and she thought about her place in the world.
And I'd say for me, I think I have been reading her mail for a very long time. And so it isn't one moment. It's frequently where life and Abigail's writings intersect. And so that can mean different things for me at different times. But it is amazing to me how often you can be reading these letters and they resonate and you find relevance. And I know that is true from talking to people. It is fascinating to me as an editor of the papers to see how and where people find meaning and then how they use those letters for all sorts of really creative purposes. But I think that's when you have so many words, it can hit different depending where you are in your life. And it's fascinating.
Can you expand a little on the friendship that Abigail and Mercy had, the falling out that they had, and how they eventually came back together?
Well, there's a lovely case upstairs in the exhibit. Do you want to start that?
Either.
Well, they started growing apart when Abigail joined her husband abroad, in the 1780s. And to put it very bluntly, I think Mercy Otis Warren started feeling that both Abigail and John were getting too big for their britches and were abandoning some of the egalitarian principles of the American Revolution. Then when John Adams was vice president, she asked John if he could find a position for her son, and he rebuked her. He refused her in a very hostile way. And then after the publication of this History of the Revolution, they had a very definite falling out. They exchanged a series, John and Mercy, and really they were both blaming the other. And it was really Abigail Adams who kind of brokered a reconciliation around 1814 or so.
1812 is when they sent the jewelry.
Okay, 1812.
But there's this really amazing letter from, I don't remember exactly when James Warren died. 1807?
Something like that, yeah.
And
Z says that's correct.
thank you. And Abigail, she's actually writing to her son, and she explains how sorry she feels for Mercy because of the loss of her partner, but that she doesn't feel like she can write because of the divide in their relationship. And it's this incredibly powerful letter. And then, it takes her another something like 6 months to actually write and say, I'm sorry, I couldn't at the time. And it's this slow process of reconciliation. And I don't think they ever attained the closeness they did early. But I think also that Mercy Otis Warren dearly loved Nabby, the Adams's daughter. And I think after she died, that also kind of helped bring them back together because Mercy keenly felt that loss as well.
Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention politics, which divides so many families today. Adams became a high federalist, favors strong centralized government. His opponents called him a crypto monarch or aristocrat. Mercy Otis Warren and her husband became supporters of Jefferson, egalitarianism, pro-France. And really, that was a real underlying problem that surfaced in the 1790s and continued even after they ostensibly reconciled.
Deeply relatable, right?
Yes.
Relevant.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And if we add the age gap
Yeah.
onto that too, which might have had some influences on their political leanings.
This will be our final question.
Hi, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing all of you. My quick question is that when I was a student, the narrative was that of Republican motherhood, especially for Abigail Adams. Is that something that we still see as sort of an appropriate framing for Abigail Adams and women in her time? Or is that something that we now see as limiting when we talk about Abigail Adams and her accomplishments and other women during the Revolution as well?
That's you.
Huh?
You wrote it.
You wanna?
That's not me.
Yeah, I think that one's you.
All right.
That one's you.
Like, no.
Mhm.
Well, remember, they didn't use the term, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's a scholarly term that refers to the way in which women's roles, gender roles changed during and after the Revolution. It refers to small r Republican, the idea that as wives and mothers, women during and after the Revolution could make a contribution to the polity. And so this concept has been criticized a lot by some scholars. It's been regarded as not an adequate explanation to explain the full range of women's roles. And obviously, for enslaved women, for indigenous women, for lower class women who weren't close to the war itself, it may not have reflected the reality of their lives, but certainly at the level of discourse, at the level of the way in which men and women talked about women's roles after the American Revolution. I think there's still a general acceptance that, that there was a change and that women for the first time were not politically invisible, and that even if they couldn't vote, even in their roles as wives and mothers, they could educate their sons and encourage their husbands to serve the government and to vote and women needed to be educated to do that. So you have a big push for increasing women's education after the American Revolution. And that's indisputable that there's a great push for women's education. So I think in many ways, while the term itself may not be as descriptive or accurate as we would like, I think there was a profound change in the conceptualization of the way Americans thought about women and politics, even if the realities didn't always match up to that. And the lack of the vote for women is obviously one of the most obvious points to speaking to that.
What's that?
Although women could vote in New Jersey from 1776 to 1807.
Asterisk.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Zagari, Bynum, Martin, and Beatty for that powerful discussion about lived experiences of these founding women and a little bit about provenance too, which of course is just in the right spot for that. I'd like to thank you, our audience, both in person and online, for joining us this evening. Programs such as this are possible due to support provided by friends like you. More info about our upcoming programs can be found on our website, masshist.org. Please note our building does close in about 20 minutes. Those teachers, please see Kate on your way out for a small token of our thanks. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists and to you. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.